Ethan and Grace's story began in the most unassuming of places, a small neighborhood grocery store. Grace was carefully picking out vegetables when she noticed Ethan struggling to balance a bag of potatoes and a carton of milk. She couldn't help but chuckle, which made Ethan look up, embarrassed but smiling. He used the moment to start a conversation, and before long, they discovered they had much in common. Both were hardworking, fiercely independent, and determined to build a life better than the one they had grown up with. Hi there, I'm Goldie, and welcome to Goldie's Love Stories. Grace worked as a seamstress at a small tailoring shop, spending long hours hemming pants, mending torn jackets, and sewing custom dresses for clients who always wanted perfection on a tight budget. Ethan, on the other hand, was a machine operator at a local factory. His days were spent monitoring heavy equipment, fixing mechanical issues, and ensuring the production line never stopped. It was physically demanding work, but Ethan took pride in it. He believed that every bolt he tightened and lever he pulled was a step toward a better future for him and Grace. Their life together began humbly. After a few months of dating, they moved into a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards. They made it their own with mismatched furniture picked up at yard sales and curtains Grace sewed from leftover fabric scraps. Despite their modest surroundings, their home was filled with love, laughter, and dreams of what could be. Ethan and Grace supported each other through everything. When Grace's hands ached from stitching late into the night to meet a rush order, Ethan massaged them and reassured her that her hard work would pay off. When Ethan came home exhausted from pulling a double shift at the factory, Grace would surprise him with his favorite meal, a small but meaningful reminder of her appreciation. Over time, they began to see the fruits of their labor. They saved enough to replace their old, unreliable car and started putting money aside for the down payment on a modest house. Ethan took great pride in being the primary breadwinner. It wasn't that Grace didn't contribute. Her work was vital, but Ethan had always been influenced by his late father's belief that a man's job is to provide for his family. It was a principle he held close to his heart, even if Grace didn't fully agree with it. Their steady life was upended when Ethan's factory announced layoffs and restructuring. Though Ethan wasn't let go, he was demoted to a less critical role, which came with a sharp pay cut. The news hit him like a freight train. For the first time in their marriage, he felt like he was letting Grace down. He couldn't bear the thought of her seeing him as anything less than the strong, capable man she'd married. Ethan chose not to tell her about the demotion. Instead, he quietly adjusted their budget, cutting corners wherever he could. When Grace asked why they no longer went out for their favorite Friday dinners or why he seemed more tense than usual, Ethan deflected her questions with vague answers about needing to save more. But no amount of frugality could stretch their income enough to cover the mounting bills. A series of unexpected expenses, a car repair, an increase in rent, and Grace needing new equipment for her sewing, pushed them into the red. Ethan felt like he was drowning, and the shame of his situation grew heavier with each passing day. Desperate to keep his failure hidden, Ethan made a reckless decision. One afternoon, he borrowed money from a man named Victor, whom he'd overheard his coworkers talking about. Victor was known for providing quick cash with no questions asked, but at a steep price. "I'll pay it back as soon as I can," Ethan assured himself, signing the paperwork. He believed he could fix everything before Grace ever found out, but deep down, he knew he was building his escape on a shaky foundation. What Ethan didn't realize was that secrets like his never stay hidden for long. Grace had always prided herself on her ability to read Ethan. She could tell when he was in a good mood by the way he whistled as he walked in the door, or when something was bothering him by the quiet way he kicked off his boots. Lately, it seemed like every small sign pointed to stress. He came home more tired than usual, his shoulders hunched and his answers curt. When she asked if everything was all right, Ethan would force a smile and mumble something about work being busy. Grace accepted his explanation at first. After all, Her own work as a seamstress was hectic, especially with the holiday season bringing in extra orders from demanding customers. Still, something about Ethan's behavior didn't sit right. He'd stopped suggesting their weekend walks through the park, a routine they'd both enjoyed for years. Their shared moments, like sipping coffee together in the morning or chatting about their days, grew fewer and more strained. Then there were the small but puzzling financial changes. Grace kept a mental tally of their expenses, and the numbers weren't adding up. She also noticed that their fridge was emptier than usual and that Ethan hesitated when she suggested minor purchases, like replacing their worn-out curtains. When she asked why he seemed so frugal lately, he brushed it off. "Just trying to plan ahead," he said with a half-hearted shrug. Though Grace trusted Ethan deeply, her instincts whispered that something was wrong. She started paying closer attention. One evening, she found an envelope tucked inside Ethan's work jacket. It was unmarked, but the weight of it and the faint sound of paper shifting inside made her uneasy. When Ethan caught her holding the jacket, he quickly snatched it away. His reaction was sharp and out of character, and it only deepened her suspicions. Ethan, meanwhile, was trapped in a web of his own making. The money he borrowed from Victor had only temporarily eased the pressure. The lender's terms were far harsher than he'd anticipated, with towering interest rates that compounded weekly. No matter how many extra shifts he picked up at the factory, he couldn't seem to make a dent in the debt. Victor, on the other hand, wasn't a patient man. He began calling Ethan regularly, demanding payments and issuing veiled threats about what would happen if he failed to pay up. Ethan did his best to keep these calls away from Grace, answering them only when she wasn't home or stepping outside when his phone rang. But secrets have a way of slipping through even the tightest cracks. One evening, the crack finally appeared. Grace was at home, stitching a patch onto a customer's torn jacket, when the phone rang. She answered, expecting a friendly voice on the other end. Instead, she was greeted by a gruff and unfamiliar tone. "Ethan there," the man barked. "Who's calling?" Grace asked, surprised by the abruptness. "Victor. Tell him he's late on his payment. If he doesn't get me what he owes, there's going to be trouble." Grace's heart sank as the pieces fell into place. She barely managed to respond before the caller hung up. For a moment, she sat frozen, her hands trembling over the phone. What payment? What trouble? When Ethan walked through the door later that evening, Grace was waiting for him in the kitchen. The usual warmth in her eyes was replaced with a stormy determination. She held her arms crossed, her posture straight and unyielding. "Ethan, who is Victor?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Ethan froze in his tracks, his face pale. "Victor," he repeated, feigning ignorance. "Don't lie to me," Grace said, holding up the phone. "He called here tonight. Said you're late on a payment. What's going on, Ethan's?" Caught in the spotlight of her gaze, Ethan felt his carefully constructed facade crumble. He had no choice but to confess. In halting words, he explained the demotion at work, the financial strain, and the decision to borrow money without telling her. "I didn't want to worry you," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I thought I could fix it on my own, but you couldn't," Grace finished for him, her tone sharp. "Ethan, why didn't you just talk to me? We've always faced everything together. Why would you think I wouldn't understand?" "I didn't want you to think I'd failed," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's expression softened, but her disappointment was evident. "Ethan, we promised to share our burdens, remember? You don't have to go through this alone." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the weight of his secret lift, though it was replaced by a new heaviness, the realization of how deeply he'd hurt Grace by keeping her in the dark. He sat down beside her, and together they began unraveling the mess he had created. Grace was determined to help him find a way out of the situation, but she also knew that trust needed to be rebuilt. For both of their sakes, she was going to make sure he learned an important lesson about partnership and honesty. The morning after Ethan's confession, The tension in the house was palpable. Grace had barely slept, replaying his words in her mind. While she understood his pride and fear, she couldn't shake the sting of being excluded from such a critical part of their lives. It wasn't just the money or the debt. It was the fact that Ethan had faced it all alone, leaving her in the dark. Over breakfast, their usual easy conversation was replaced by an awkward silence. Grace finally broke it, her voice calm but firm. "We need to figure this out, Ethan," she said, pushing her untouched plate aside. "How much do you owe Victor exactly?" Ethan hesitated before muttering the amount. Grace's eyes widened. "How did you think you were going to pay that back?" she asked, incredulous. "I thought if I worked enough overtime, I could." "Overtime won't cover that, Ethan," Grace interrupted. "You're barely bringing in enough to keep us afloat as it is. And this man, he doesn't sound like the type to wait patiently for his money." Ethan nodded, shame clouding his expression. "I know. I messed up, Grace. But I didn't want to burden you." Grace sighed. "I'm already burdened, Ethan. This affects both of us. We're in this together, whether you like it or not." With that, Grace stood up, grabbed her notebook, and began listing out their expenses. Ethan watched as she calculated with precision, her pen flying across the page. "We'll need to cut back even more," Grace said, her tone matter-of-fact. "I can take on extra sewing jobs, but that won't be enough. You're going to have to talk to Victor and negotiate more time." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of facing Victor. The man's menacing tone still echoed in his mind. But he knew Grace was right. This wasn't a problem he could avoid any longer. Later that day, Ethan made his way to the small, dingy office where Victor conducted his business. The man greeted him with a predatory grin. "Ethan," Victor drawled, leaning back in his chair. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Ethan swallowed hard. "I haven't. I need more time to pay you back." Victor's grin faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "More time, huh? And what am I supposed to do while I wait? I don't run a charity, you know." Ethan clenched his fists, his pride warring with his fear. "I'm asking for a little leniency. I'll pay you every cent I owe, but I need more time." Victor leaned forward, his expression hard. "Time costs extra, Ethan. You want an extension? Fine. But I'll be raising the interest." Ethan's heart sank. He had no choice but to agree, knowing it would dig him even deeper into the hole he was already in. When he returned home, Grace could tell immediately from his slumped shoulders and haunted expression that the meeting hadn't gone well. "What happened?" she asked. "He gave me more time," Ethan said flatly. "But the interest went up." Grace closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "We'll deal with it," she said after a moment. "But from now on, we do this together. No more secrets." True to her word, Grace threw herself into finding ways to bring in more money. She took on additional clients, even accepting tedious alterations that she normally would have turned down. Ethan, inspired by her determination, asked his manager at the factory for every extra shift available. The long hours and sleepless nights began to take their toll, but the couple pushed through, united by their shared goal. However, the stress was mounting. The weight of their debt and the looming presence of Victor cast a shadow over their lives. Grace started to notice the toll it was taking on Ethan. His shoulders seemed permanently hunched, and his once cheerful demeanor was replaced by a grim focus on work. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Grace reached for his hand. "Ethan," she said softly, "I don't care about how much money we make. I care about us. I need you to remember that." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt and exhaustion. "I just want to give you the life you deserve, Grace." "You already have," she said firmly. "We'll get through this, but not at the cost of your health or our relationship. Promise me you'll let me help carry this burden." Ethan nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. The couple continued to chip away at their debt, inch by inch. Grace's resourcefulness and Ethan's hard work began to make a difference, but they both knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Victor was still a threat, and the path ahead was uncertain. What they did know, however, was that they would face whatever came next together. And for the first time in a long while, that thought gave them strength. As the weeks stretched into months, Grace and Ethan's relentless efforts began to bear fruit. Every spare dollar went toward paying off their debt, and the oppressive shadow of Victor's looming threats slowly started to recede. Grace's sewing business flourished, thanks to her dedication and word-of-mouth referrals. Customers appreciated her skill and warmth, bringing more work than she could have imagined. Ethan, too, found a way to bring in more income. After working long hours at the factory, he began fixing machines in his free time, using the skills he'd honed over years as a machine operator. His coworkers, impressed by his expertise, paid him to repair their old, worn-out equipment, giving him a much-needed boost in earnings. Despite their financial challenges, the couple found ways to keep their spirits high. Grace insisted on small moments of joy, a homemade dinner lit by candles, a walk through the neighborhood to admire the changing seasons, or simply sitting together and reminiscing about their early days. These moments reminded them why they had chosen each other and strengthened their bond. One brisk autumn morning, Grace sat at her sewing machine, stitching a patch onto a customer's jacket, when the phone rang. Recognizing the number, she hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." "Grace, it's Victor," the voice on the other end said, his tone gruff as usual. Her heart skipped a beat.
"What do you want?"
"Tell your husband he's paid up," Victor said, his tone begrudging. "Debt's clear." For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. Relief flooded her, and she let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said, though she knew the man on the other end didn't deserve her gratitude. When Ethan returned home that evening, Grace met him at the door with a radiant smile. "It's done," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "We're free." Ethan's face lit up in disbelief. "Are you serious?" She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. Victor called. "The debt is paid." Ethan pulled her into a tight embrace, his own eyes misty. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. With the weight of the debt lifted, life slowly began to return to normal. Ethan and Grace decided to keep their frugal habits, vowing never to let money come between them again. They rebuilt their savings, piece by piece, and Ethan even saved enough to take Grace on a small weekend getaway, a promise he'd made during one of their hardest nights. Sitting by a quiet lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan turned to Grace and took her hand. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we went through," he said. "I never want to hide anything from you again. I let my pride get in the way, and I'm sorry." Grace squeezed his hand. "We've both learned a lot," she said. "But what matters is that we faced it together. And now we're stronger for it." Back at home, Ethan received unexpected news from the factory. His hard work and initiative hadn't gone unnoticed. The management, impressed by his dedication, offered him a new role, one that came with a raise and more stability. When he shared the news with Grace, she beamed with pride. "You deserve this, Ethan," she said. "And so do you," he replied. "None of this would have been possible without you." With their finances stable once more, Grace decided to expand her sewing business. She started teaching sewing classes to others in their community, sharing her skills and helping others find a way to support themselves. The classes brought her a sense of purpose and joy, and Ethan loved seeing her passion come to life. One evening, as they sat together on their worn but comfortable couch, Grace looked around their modest home. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love, laughter, and the strength they had built together. "We may not have everything," she said, resting her head on Ethan's shoulder, "but we have each other. And that's more than enough." Ethan kissed her forehead and smiled. It always has been. Together, they had faced their challenges, learned from their mistakes, and emerged stronger. Their simple beginnings had taught them the value of perseverance and partnership, and now they looked forward to a future built on trust, resilience, and love. Thanks for watching. How would you rate this story? Give it 1 to 5 hearts in the comments, and let me know what you thought. This is a brand new channel, and your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your likes, comments, and shares help this community grow, and I'd be so grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.